The English Montreal School Board received a grant, a NOVA grant from the Jewish Community Foundation of Montreal for a Holocaust Education program, which we launched at the beginning of the school year. We're working very hard, as we always do, to educate our students about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And before I worked at the EMSB, I've been here 24 years, I worked at the Canadian Jewish Congress, which was the national representative body of the Jewish community of Canada, fought anti-Semitism, had a long history, and did a lot of great work. And in 1996, I met a man named Steven Rambam, a Nazi hunter, a private investigator from New York, who came to Canada and basically using a phone book, he tracked down all these Nazi war criminals living in Canada. It's a fascinating story. And I know at Westmount High School today, we are streaming live, not only to the grade 10 students in Westmount High in their classrooms, but also to anyone who's watching on YouTube. And it's a fascinating story. I'm very excited to be part of it. Canada did have legislation to prosecute and deport Nazi war criminals. It's something that obviously the students watching today are probably not aware of. So before I introduce Steven Rambam, I want everyone to watch this clip from CBC television, which goes back about 27 years on Steven.
For years we've been hearing about Nazi war criminals hiding in Canada. You wouldn't expect to be invited into their homes, and if that happened, you certainly wouldn't believe they would confess their wartime activities to you. But that is exactly what seems to have happened to an enterprising private eye from New York. Steven Rambam has interviewed almost 60 suspected war criminals living in Canada, and he's accumulated some startling evidence. In this full-edition documentary, the National's Terence McKenna tracks the hunter and the hunted.
Just after 8 p.m. on a cold December night in Toronto, two private investigators set out on a mission.
Oh, absolutely.
Steve Rambam of New York and Joe Schachter of Aurelia have been friends and business associates for years. Both are licensed private detectives. Normally they carry out fraud investigations for insurance companies, occasionally for government departments. Sometimes they work on criminal trials. Rambam says he has even been retained by the U.S. Secret Service.
You remember him?
Yep. Tonight they are in the closing stages of a 2-year search that has taken them back and forth across Canada, a mission they have worked on in their spare time without pay.
In March.
They are looking for alleged Nazi war criminals and others who participated in the murder of 6 million Jews over 50 years ago during the Second World War.
All right, give me a second.
The routine is now familiar. Rambam wears a microphone disguised as a fountain pen.
Got it? Got it? All right.
His conversations are recorded and transmitted out to Schachter, who will wait outside in the car.
Got clear signal?
Just fine.
All right.
This is their third visit to this retirement complex. Rambam says that several of the names on the buzzers here match up with lists of suspected Nazi collaborators from Lithuania.
Mr. He was allegedly a member of the Lithuanian 12th SS Battalion. I recognize the name of an individual who's a former Lithuanian chief of police. I recognize a third individual who is a member of the National Labor Defense Battalion, which was involved in activities under investigation.
In the last 2 years, Rambam says he has located 159 residents of Canada whose names appear on lists of suspected war criminals. Using an assumed identity and under false pretenses, he has recorded interviews with 60 of them. He claims that 7 have confessed to him on tape that they were involved in the murder of Jews. In the last few weeks, there have been some stories about him in Canadian newspapers, and he's worried that his technique for getting in the door and talking to suspects is probably not going to work anymore.
Who are you? My name is Sal Romano. Can I speak to you for a moment?
No.
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 He's right about that. It looks as if the scam has run its course.
Well, sure.
You might wonder what Steve Rambam could possibly say to make such people welcome him into their homes and talk to him. This is how he did it. He started by creating a fictitious university in Central America, and an identity to go with it.
This is St. Paul's Cathedral, the famous St. Paul's Cathedral designed by Sir Christopher Wren. And this motto is Querde scientiam invenite justitiam. This means seek knowledge, find justice. Our shtick was that we were university faculty members working as assistant professors, trying to reach full professorship. We had to write our doctoral thesis to get it. And the doctoral thesis was, this is the title, Against the Interchangeability of Military and Civilian Forces in a Law Enforcement Support Role During Wartime. Which, I mean, my eyes roll back when I say that. The gist of it is, let's say we were interviewing a policeman. We'd say, look, you were trained as a policeman. You wanted to help your community. It's not true, but that's what we'd say. We know that as a policeman, you were not trained to work in military situations. This was something unusual and unique for you. You didn't know what to do. So when you were forced to to support these terrible Germans and what they did to the Jews, you didn't know how to handle it, and it was unavoidable that there would be atrocities because you weren't trained to do this. And the cops that we interviewed, the Lithuanian cops and the cops from other areas, they'd go, you're right, that's exactly what happened. And they'd tell us what happened.
I'm going to introduce for you now a hero, someone that I'm proud to have known for all these years and stayed in touch. He has visited our schools over the years, but this is a very special time. So I'd like to introduce Steven Rambam, coming to us live from Texas, where he's on a case, which he won't tell us about. Welcome, Steven.
You're correct. I won't tell you about it. That was a blast from the past, seeing that. I mean, back in the day when I could just throw on a leather jacket and go and do an investigation.
Well, Steven, first of all, welcome, and welcome with the students of Westmount High School and anyone else watching this on YouTube right now. We've had the pleasure of had you come to speak at our schools. This is for students a living history lesson that they're going to see, something that they would not believe, something they would think is a book of fiction. We are going to let the students and anyone else ask questions. If you want to ask a question, you'll do it in one of the chats on YouTube or on any other socials, and we'll read them out. So please do that towards the end of the talk. Steven, I want to begin by you explaining to everyone out there, because for a lot of people, it's the first time they've ever seen or heard from you. A lot of young people here. Tell us what you did.
Well, I'm an investigator. I was an investigator for about 20 years before I started the war crimes investigations. I'm Jewish, and I'd been hearing over the years from people in the Jewish community in Canada that there was a ridiculous number of war criminals, of Nazi war criminals and Nazi collaborators in Canada, primarily in the Toronto and Montreal areas. They'd never been brought to justice. Nobody was going to prosecute them. And they were going to die in their beds, unexposed. So being an investigator, I looked into it and I was astounded at what was possible. So I rounded up some other investigators. By the way, the vast majority of them, not Jewish people. Only one other Jewish person, Joe Schachter, who you saw in that abortive clip. And we decided we were going to identify a big batch of war criminals in Canada. And then because we're investigators, we're not just historians, we were going to take it to the next logical step, which was we were going to put together an undercover operation where I would go, knock on a door, either alone or with one other person, and interview the war criminals and get them to try to give us information. And I have a lot of experience in undercover operations. I've done it with some federal agencies, some police departments, independently overseas. And I thought it might work. I thought it would be a unique way to address this terrible issue that wasn't going anywhere. So I was on a job down in Belize. Belize is a pretty crooked place. You can get dummy bank accounts, you can get fake identities, you can launder your money there. And I set up a dummy university called St. Paul's University of the Americas. Um, the only question they had when I told the local people I wanted to set up a university and get an address and get a phone number was the guy said, "Oh, should it be accredited?" I said, "No, no, no. Let's not get carried away." So I set up a university and I had some dummy ID, good dummy ID, passport, driver's license, other things under the name of Salvatore Romano. So I resurrected that ID because obviously I couldn't knock on the door of a war criminal and say, "Hi, I'm Steve Rambam. I'm a Jewish guy from New York. Would you talk to me about all the Jews you killed?" Um, so I went as a supposed assistant professor, non-Jewish guy, knocked on their doors with a backup team out in the car. I was transmitting from a pen so they could hear everything. And first thing we did was we compiled lists of Nazi war criminals. And I want to tell the students listening today that I found out, shocked to find out, and I think you'll be surprised to find out, that nearly everything that you've heard about the Nazi war criminals and about the Holocaust, the post-Holocaust, is not correct. I thought that all the Nazis were hiding, that the FBI was looking for them, that the RCMP was looking for them, Israeli spies were looking for them, that they had gotten plastic surgery, changed their names, they were hiding down in Argentina. Not true. The bulk of the worst guys, the people who with their own hands shot and stabbed and beat and killed 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews, ran the concentration camps. They were the concentration camp guards. They came to the West. Nearly 10,000 of them came to America. Between 1,500 and 2,000 of them came to Canada. Disproportionately, Canada got the largest batch of hardcore Nazi war criminals. And when we started compiling lists, I thought it was going to be impossible to get names and dates of birth and, criminal histories on these war criminals. It took 90 days to get 1,000 dossiers, 1,000. Our biggest problem was we had too many war criminals in Canada. So we took the 1,000 names that we got and we winnowed it down to the most horrific 200 of the war criminals. For example, there was one war criminal that his entire dossier said specialized in the murder of children. When they were involved in an action, as they called it, to kill Jews, and there were a lot of children, even a lot of the Nazi war criminals couldn't handle it. This guy would come right in and kill all the kids. And he obviously went on the list. Once we had 200 war criminals, we started locating them. And we located 150, then we located 160. Ultimately, we stopped at, I believe, 172 of the 200 war criminals. We found addresses for them in Canada. And again, I mean, some of the people were trying to hide, a tiny number, and we found them. But the vast, vast majority, as Mike mentioned, it's not a joke, they were in the white pages in the phone book under their own names. They bought houses under their own names. They worked jobs under their own names. They got driver's licenses, bought cars, got business licenses. I mean, they lived openly. They weren't afraid because they knew in Canada, if you're a Nazi war criminal, you're safe. Nobody's looking for you. And by the way, let me just say, collectively, the Nazi war criminals that we were going after, the Latvian RS Commando, the Lithuanian various groups, some of the Hungarian Arrow Cross, the various collaborators that we went after in total, killed 1.1 million of the 6 million Jews. Once you talk about killing a million people, it's enough. So what we did was we located these people, and then we set up an undercover operation. And I began the first undercover interview that I did of a war criminal was in Hope, British Columbia. The guy's name was Antanas Kenstavicius. And frankly, I didn't believe it was going to work. I did not believe I could knock on the door of a mass murderer and have him say to me, come on in, have a shot of schnapps, his wife come over and offer me some cake, and the two of them sit down and tell me about all the war crimes they were involved in. But that's precisely what happened. Knocked on his door, introduced myself as Assistant Professor Romano, told him I wanted to talk to him about his wartime activities and experiences. He invited me in. We sat at his kitchen table, and he detailed to me how his unit had rounded up 5,000 Jews in the Svencionis region of Lithuania. Now, by the way, this horrible person was the chief of police in that region of Lithuania. And many of the war criminals who were rounding up the Jews and abusing the Jews and killing the Jews were his cops. And the people turning in the Jews and helping beat them were the next door neighbors of the Jews. Imagine, your next door neighbor comes out of his house with a stick and starts beating you and shoves you on a truck, and you get taken away just because you're a Jew or whatever you are. Something really incredible. So they rounded up approximately 5,000 Jews, of which 1,000 of them were children, including small babies, in mother's arms. And they brought them to an abandoned cavalry base and shoved them in the barracks and locked them in the barracks. No room to lay down and sleep. People had to stand up. They took turns laying down or sitting down. And they were held for 6 days. And the reason they were held for 6 days was a lot of these people, when they were being rounded up, they had a feeling something was wrong. So they grabbed their valuables, jewelry and money and things like that, hid it, their valuables on their body. And the Nazis, by that time, this is 1941, they were experts at rounding up Jews and killing Jews. And they told their Lithuanian collaborators, here's what you do. Lock up the Jews, especially the Jews with families, with kids, and give them no food and give them no water. First of all, it'll make them weak. They'll be compliant, but they will pull out their valuables and they will bribe you with those valuables to get food and a cup of water for their kids. And when they stop even buying a cup of water for their little children, they have no more money, because a mother or a father will take their last penny to look after their child. A really terrible process, a really terrible procedure. So when they stopped buying water and buying food, they were given another day to be more exhausted and more beaten down. And then they were taken in groups of 10, as this fella, Antanas Kenstavicius, told me. They were taken to the ditch. They were shot, first the men, in groups of 10. They didn't know if the people were going to fight or not. So they first took the men, killed all the men. Then they took the women and the children together. And this war criminal is recounting to me this whole horrible story. And he says, and then the men, the women, the children finished. We be done. No more Jews. He told me I think the date was November 6th, 1941. We be done. No more Jews. Like it was a job well done. Like he was proud of himself. And I talked to him about other killings by his unit and things like that. And then I left and I went out to the car where my backup team was waiting. And I got in the car and we drove off. I wanted to get out of town very quickly because I still couldn't believe that the guy talked to us. I figured, he was going to suddenly wake up and make a call to some young, tough guys, and we were going to have to shoot our way out of British Columbia. But it went perfectly. We drove all the way back to the border to drive back to Seattle and to fly out of Seattle. And I just couldn't speak. And the driver of the car was a non-Jewish guy, a very, very tough guy, kind of a famous guy. And he's driving along. He was listening to the whole thing on a hidden earpiece as I was transmitting. And after about 20 miles, I looked over at him and tears were running down his face. It was just unbelievable. And that was our proof of concept. And over a period of about 2 years, we interviewed a little over 60, I think, might have been as many as 70 war criminals. And we got 7 full confessions. By the way, the one that I just told you about, the first guy that I interviewed, I turned the tape over to the National. I'm sorry you couldn't hear the whole thing. Maybe Mike Cohen will figure out a way to make it work, before we disconnect. But I gave the tape to the National and to 60 Minutes and to Dateline, and they played the whole thing on the air with closed captions at the bottom, closed captioning at the bottom. So we did these interviews. The last 20 interviews that I did, because I knew nobody was going to believe that we could knock on the door of Nazi war criminals and get them to confess. And by the way, even the ones who didn't detail their crimes, every single war criminal except for one confirmed their identity, confirmed their date of birth. So we were able to confirm that they were part of the killing units, which was almost as good. Overwhelming success. And the last 20 people, I took first one reporter and then another reporter. I took an editor from the Jerusalem Post, and then I took an individual who was an anchor man from TV, and I took them each for 10 interviews before we shut down, so that members of the media would actually be present and would see this happening and see the routine and hear the confessions, and nobody could say it was fantasy or I faked the tapes or whatever. Then I went public. That's how I met Mike Cohen. He was involved with the Canadian Jewish Congress. They helped us publicize this. And then, as a last step, we publicly solicited for informants, people who were going to give us inside information on the Nazi war crimes. In other words, people who were members of the killing units who could say, yes, I was there. Yes, we killed the Jews. This is what happened. And here's who was there. This person, this person, this person. So we could force the RCMP to build criminal cases against them. Because don't forget, this is not history. This is not, some political issue. These were people who went and killed hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people. It's a little hard to comprehend, but these people were mass murderers on a world-class scale, and they needed to be prosecuted as murderers. So we started something called 1-800-RAT-ON-A-Nazi. And we got a number of people, and my team developed other people, and we ultimately got 3 informants. The first one was a college professor right where you are in Montreal by the name of Adalbert Lallier. He was in the SS. You've probably heard of the SS. They wore the black uniforms. They were the worst guys. And he talked about a killing that was committed in his presence by a guy named Julius Fiel, his commander. Field picked up a rifle, shot 7 people in a ditch. And we were able to get Julius Field arrested by the Germans, prosecuted, convicted of the 7 murders, which was a great victory, and sent to jail. I will tell you that Adalbert Lallier received numerous death threats and numerous other security issues as a result of cooperating. And in fact, he recently died or was killed within the past, I think, 60 days in his house north of Montreal. There was a mysterious fire, and he burnt up in the fire quite recently. So, I mean, this is still continuing to this day. You know, I apologize. I don't have more time to give you details. This is quite a long, I think, you know, worthwhile story to recount, and I wish I had more time. Mike wants to bring me up there to meet with you. I'm happy to do it. But those are the high points, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
And we will accept questions. If people want to put questions in the chat, they can start doing so now. I am going to continue, though. We are here till about noon. So we have about another half hour. Now, Stephen, when I got hired at the Canadian Jewish Congress, I was brought into the office of Jack Silverstone, who was the executive vice president, and I had an interview. And I had a study before that interview. And the first question he asked me is, have you ever heard of the Deschênes Commission? I had. Now, the Deschênes Commission, to his credit, former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, whose wife, by the way, Mila, went to Westmount High School, he created the Deschênes Commission to investigate the presence of Nazi war criminals in Canada. And they adopted legislation, and they did go after Nazi war criminals. Jerry Wiener, who is Minister of Citizenship, who is watching this program today, I spoke to him yesterday. Jerry Wiener, to his credit, as Minister of Citizenship, working with his policy advisor, Neil Drapkin, they revoked the citizenship and deported some Nazi war criminals. They weren't very successful, though, in actually prosecuting Nazi war criminals. Stephen, did the Canadian government do enough in your eyes? Stephen.
Canadian government did almost nothing. By the way, you should strike the S of citizens, deported citizens. If you look at the end of that broadcast that you were showing a piece of, the National quite correctly pointed out that Canada deported 1 Nazi war criminal, 1. And Terry McKenna, great guy, wonderful guy. Him and his brother are terrific people. He held up his finger and he said they deported exactly 1 Nazi war criminal. Now, let me tell you, Canada had disproportionately the largest number per capita of Nazi war criminals in the world, except for the Soviet Union. And I will tell you, Soviet Union, terrible, horrible, as bad as the Nazis almost, but at least they handled Nazi war criminals correctly. They rounded everybody up and prosecuted them and executed them. And I will tell you, the United States had, my country, had approximately 10,000 Nazi war criminals in the entire time. First of all, they didn't do anything for 50 years. And then Congresswoman Holtzman passed the Holtzman Act, where they had to do something. They formed the Office of Special Investigations, and they only got about 150 war criminals in the subsequent 30 years, I think it was, since 79, so almost 40 years. Canada, I will tell you that every war criminal that I interviewed, one of my questions was, have you been bothered? Did the RCMP come to see you? And I would say 75% of the war criminals said, yeah, I was visited by the RCMP like 1950 something or 1960 something, but nobody's bothered me since then. The guy I told you about, Antanas Kenstavicius, the Canadian government and the Canadian Jewish Congress had his name and his location in 1949, which means almost 50 years before I visited him. It was not hard what I did. I think I'm a good investigator, but I'm not the only good investigator. The RCMP is supposedly quite good, but you couldn't prove it by their war crimes unit. They didn't get one single person criminally prosecuted. Canada has not prosecuted a single Nazi war criminal. They deported one guy, and that was it.
Jacob Luchins, I remember.
I don't recall his name, but I can tell you that you had people that were in the special killing units, the Einsatzkommando, the special units that literally rounded up the Jews and killed them. That's all they existed for. They were killing units to round up Jews, gypsies, and other people the Nazis didn't like. And they would put them in the back of a van, and with the exhaust pipes running into the van, and they would drive 20 minutes to a disposal location. And when they opened the back doors of the van, everybody would be dead. They'd throw them in the ditch. They'd go back for another load. They were also the riflemen. By the way, I apologize for that background noise. There is apparently a crazy parrot. I'm not making this up. There's a parrot in the kitchen.
That's a parrot.
A parrot.
Okay.
So if I go in there, I'm going to have to make like a parrot sandwich.
That is really something. Maybe that parrot could be a great co-investigator for you, by the way, because they talk.
I can go undercover as a pirate. I can put him on my shoulder and.
Absolutely. Steven, we have a question. The question is, how old were these men when you met them? And I suppose that Nazi war criminals, there would be no more alive. None of them would be alive right now.
So let me take those questions backwards. Anybody who is a Nazi war criminal who's alive today is going to be in their mid to late 90s, and there's no point in going after them. They've escaped. In fact, everybody in Canada has escaped who is a Nazi war criminal. But worldwide, most of them have escaped. It's one of the great shames of the world, and it emboldens other Nazi war criminals. There's a famous story that Himmler said to Hitler, what is the world going to think of us for what we're doing to the Jews? And Hitler said, who remembers the Armenians, which was an earlier Holocaust of more than 1 million people. Any Nazi war criminal that is around today is in mid to late 90s or over 100, and the world's worst lawyer will be able to stall the prosecution of that person until they die in their bed. So that's it. We're done. When I interviewed these people, they were mostly in their 60s, certainly well within the appropriate age to arrest them, throw them in jail, make them cooperate against their fellow mass murderers, and prosecute them.
I remember going to the trials myself. We have a question from Chantel Claybrew, who is a teacher at Westmount High School, who does an excellent job at teaching about the Holocaust. She wants to know, why do you think there is a rise in anti-Semitism online and by celebrities? I guess we're talking about Kanye West. What should our students do as they see it regularly on social media?
Okay, a phenomenal question. Thank you for asking that. First of all, let me tell you, anti-Semitism is rising. One of the reasons I'm in San Antonio is I'm helping set up synagogue safety units for all the synagogues in town. There have been threats against the synagogues, some of them to the point where the FBI has advised the synagogue a couple of times to close for Sabbath services, and to their credit, the synagogue said, no problem, our people are armed, we're not closing, and they held services. It's getting worse and worse and worse. Anti-Semitism is growing. Anti-Semitism is being mainstreamed, where it is now socially acceptable. A lot of the potential terrorists against Jews are being caught because it's now socially acceptable to go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or TikTok and say, look, I've got a gun, I've got this bomb, and I'm going to use it against the Jews. Thank you for the warning. And then we report it, and you're arrested. In fact, there's probably 100 to 200 people monitoring social media for these sort of warnings right now. So it's being mainstreamed. The best trick I've ever seen by terrible people, they are saying, we don't hate Jews. We're against Zionists. Israel is a terrible country. They're abusing the Palestinians, which is a bunch of crap. I've lived in Israel. And trust me, they're doing everything but abusing the Palestinians. Anybody who wants to see what's really going on in Israel, go and see what's really going on in Israel. And you'll see these are big fat lies. But the clever Jew haters are saying, no, we love Jews. We just hate Zionists who are oppressors of Palestinians. Now, let me tell you, the word Zionist is substantially inseparable from the word Jew. Connection with the land of Israel is a basic tenet of Judaism. It's considered a commandment for Jews to go and live in Israel and support Israel. Every holiday, every day's prayers reference Jerusalem and the land of Israel. So you can't be a Jew and not be connected to Israel. So if you say, I'm going after the people connected to Israel, you're saying Jews. That's like saying, I'm not against Canadians, just people in Montreal. It's the same thing. Finally, I have to tell you that politics have gotten so bad and so crazy. It's like everybody running for office is a mental patient. I mean, that's the only way to put it. There are the craziest conspiracy theories, the craziest political claims, and the only thing that unites the left and the right, Antifa and neo-Nazis and Republicans, Democrats, liberals and conservatives, everybody they all believe some crazy conspiracy theory that involves Jews. The Rothschilds, Jews own the banks, I wish. Jews run the newspapers, I wish. Listen, I will tell you that this is a sign of sickness in society. And I will tell you, more important for the people listening today, who I assume most of you are not Jewish, I will tell you that what happens to the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. Jews are the first warning to societal, exposure of societal ills. When crazy, crazy things start happening to Jews and start being said about Jews, and when Jews are attacked in the street, which is happening in Canada right now also, people being attacked only because they have a Jewish star on or a yarmulke or whatever. I got to tell you, everybody else is next. So you've got to go after these sick people. You've got to lock them up. You've got to expose them. And I say to anybody who's Jewish that's listening, the number one lesson of the Holocaust, and the number one lesson that I personally learned, as far as the Jewish people goes, if somebody says they want to kill you, if somebody says they want to hurt you, believe them. Believe them and act without any restriction. Do whatever you have to do to protect yourself and your community. And don't say that people have freedom of speech to recommend harming another community because of their race or their religion. Canada has America really beat in one particular area. You have great hate speech laws. I think the Jewish community today is not doing a tenth of the job that they should be doing in Canada. And I will say to any Jewish organization listening, I would be delighted to help you in any way that I can. If you want me to come up there and speak, if you want me to give you my resources from the investigative and security and law enforcement communities to help build your security, if you want to start taking steps to determine who the bad guys are today, so you can be prepared and so you can report them to law enforcement, we can help you set up teams to do that. I mean, 6 million Jews were murdered by groups of people who started out exactly as the people you see today, attacking Jews in the streets and speaking against people only because they're Jews. And a Holocaust followed that. So I think you should, it may sound like an extreme thing to say, but you should start preparing for worse things.
Stephen, another question. There seems to be an echo, Daniel, my producer. This comes from Jaden, Jaden D. He wants to know, have you ever talked to a survivor of the Holocaust?
Yes. Yes, I have. I did not have any Holocaust survivors in my family, not because they were dead, but because my family came from countries. I'm a Sephardic Jew, mostly from the Arab area and the Mediterranean. And the vast majority of the Jews that were killed in the Holocaust were not from those countries. Although some of my Italian relatives were abused, thank God they weren't killed. But I have spoken to many, many Holocaust survivors. Many of the lists that I got when I started were from the survivor groups. Many of the witnesses to war crimes that I spoke to were Holocaust survivors. And I'll tell you one just amazing story. One of the most remarkable things to come out of this investigation that I did. I was living and working in Israel when this story broke really, really big. And IBA TV, Israeli Broadcasting, decided to take the Nationals broadcast and show the full hour of it on Israeli television. And I had a cousin and a mother and I had first cousins and second cousins that I had never really met. And they invited me over to watch it, to have a meal with them and watch it on TV with them. And I went over to the house and I met the older woman, the mother, for the first time. And she was bringing out a tray of food and putting it on the table and extended her arms, and her sleeve rolled up, and there was a concentration camp number on her arm. And I got to tell you, boy, I had no idea. It's not something that people talk about. It's like, hey, did I tell you about the time I was in a concentration camp? I mean, it is the worst experience that anybody living had in their life. They don't talk about it mostly. Spielberg accomplished a miracle by getting a bunch of people to give living testimonies on video. I mean, even when I saw that, I didn't say anything to her, but we watched the broadcast, and she came over and she patted me on the shoulder, and I got to tell you, that's the best reward that I got for the entire 2-year investigation. And obviously, when I've given talks in synagogues, including in Montreal, survivors have come up to me afterwards, and they all have stuff they want to recount.
Yeah, for sure. Another question from Julian Feldman, one of our school commissioners. Did you ever identify anyone working in the United States or Canadian scientific establishment? He says that his father was a government research scientist born in a Jewish family in Leipzig, who escaped and later worked in Ottawa. As a child, Julian says he often heard rumors of former Nazis working in these organizations.
Julian, you're absolutely correct. Britain, Canada, and the United States grabbed all the German scientists they could, also all the German spies they could, Gestapo people and Abwehr people, because they needed to turn these people and their special skills against the Soviet Union, because there was a new world conflict starting. So the United States, for example, to its disgrace, had a program called Operation Paperclip, where they recruited something like 2,000 Nazi scientists and brought them to America. They worked on every facet of every major scientific program, including working for NASA. Werner von Braun was a Nazi war criminal. And I didn't have to look for these people. If I wanted a list of Nazi war criminals that were scientists, Operation Paperclip had lists. I could have gone after them anytime. But they essentially were given immunity by the US. They were given protection, and they were put to work for the US and the Canadian and the British governments. And some of them should have been put in jail. It was for some of these people who ran slave labor camps when they were doing their scientific research. I mean, Dr. Mengele, the most famous Nazi war criminal, he himself did scientific research by experimenting on living Jews, and most of them died. He did the famous twins research. A lot of these people were horrible monsters. And just in the US, there was about 2,000 of them. I don't know for sure the number in Canada, but I think about 200 came to Canada. I think about 800 came to the United Kingdom. So 3,000 altogether, let's say.
Okay, Steven, everyone sees the horrors going on in Ukraine with Russia. The question I'm getting from someone here is, do you consider Vladimir Putin to be a war criminal?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You have civilians being tied up, their hands bound, laid on the ground, and shot in the back of the head, which is identical to what happened to Jews, except Jews, they didn't tie their hands. You have schools being rocketed. You have power plants being rocketed. You have old age homes with people being killed. Hospitals with crosses on the roofs, and the word hospital in multiple languages being hit by drones that hover there, see it's a hospital, and then rocket the hospital. This is absolutely a war of terror. I will tell you, long before I did these Nazi war crimes investigations, I was involved in the movement to free Soviet Jews. I was a member of Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. I was a member of Beitar. I worked with Jewish Defense League. I worked with the Federation in the U.S. I was part of every effort to free Soviet Jews, and I became friends with many of them after they came to America. I will tell you, Putin is an old school KGB guy. A lot of people don't know this. He was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB. He did terrible things before he became prime minister and president, then prime minister and then president. He's a bad man. He's a bad man. He is a classic war criminal. And listen carefully to what I'm telling you. He will never be brought to justice unless it's by his own people, unless there's a second Russian Revolution. Nobody can touch this guy.
I think you answered the next question from me already. So we'll go to Chantal from another one of her students. It's from Kalia. Has anyone you ever interviewed been aggressive with you and or threatened you?
Yes. On one occasion, one of the war criminals, he said, hold on, I'll be right back. I'll talk to you. And he put me in the living room, and he went back into the kitchen, and I could hear him dialing the phone to give you an idea of how long ago this was. And him mumbling, and he starts talking to me, and all of a sudden the entrance door to the house, somebody uses a key, and it flings open, and a very large guy comes in with his hand in his pocket. And you can tell he's got a weapon in his hand. And it's the man's son, the Nazi war criminal's son. And he, who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you talking to my father about his wartime experience? Are you a cop? Are you trying to hurt him? And I said, sir, here's my school ID. I mean, if you watch that video, you'll see I show them my professor ID and all my fake papers. And that's what I did with this guy. I said, your father's a fascinating guy. I've been dying to interview him, and I couldn't get him on the phone. And then, thank God, the father says, yeah, I don't ever answer the phone. I hate that thing when it rings. So I said, yeah, I've been trying to reach you for months to set up an appointment. And, we've been talking, sir, tell your son. And the kid was like, oh, really? Okay. And he sat down. And then, like, as I was interviewing the father, he was like, hey, Dad, tell him that story that you told me about such and such. And he was prodding his dad to basically confess to war crimes. So it could have gone very, very bad. I will tell you, I'm a very experienced undercover investigator, and I've gone against, organized crime groups and sophisticated financial fraudsters, and I know how to set up an undercover identity. And I had some very ferocious guys sitting in a car, listening to everything. And I had an alert word. Well, I actually had two alert words. One, if I thought they needed to come and ring the bell and get me out of there. And the second, if there was a weapon displayed. And if I had dropped that word into conversation, they would have been in there, and I would have been just fine.
Okay, so we have our last question before we wrap up, and it's from a student, Noah. How do you think we as students should handle a situation if we see a classmate engaging in anti-Semitic behavior or engaging with online, I guess he means neo-Nazi groups?
Okay, so you're talking about students, and I would tell you, if an adult saw another adult saying, Heil Hitler, kill the Jews, I think the appropriate response might be a bop in the snoot. But you're talking about a student, and no disrespect to you people, I can tell from the questions and from what Mike has told me, you're an exceptionally intelligent student body. So I don't mean this in general. I'm talking about specific knuckleheads that you might encounter. Some people don't even know what they're saying. They think it's cool to say Heil Hitler and get a response. They think it's cool to say something nasty or stupid, it's always stupid, about Jews. So it's entirely possible that the person saying or doing those things is not a villain, like his dad would definitely be a villain if he did it. And it may be that he picked this up at home. There's people that pass their racism and their anti-Semitism and their stupidity onto their kids. So I would tell you what I wouldn't normally say, which is don't give the kid a punch in the nose, engage him and say, why are you saying such a stupid thing? Why do you hate Jews? And if the person has obviously thought about it and he's decided that there's some basis for him hating Jews or hating blacks or hating gay people or whatever, honestly, I think you should go to the teacher, you should go to the principal, and you should especially go to your parents, because your parents will hopefully get fired up and they'll come in and they will cause this child to be suspended and transferred to another school. Because I know that 99.99% of you people are fine and decent people, and you're not racists and you're not anti-Semites, and you don't deserve having a bum like that in your class. That person should be transferred out of the school after being given time to think about his sins, so to speak. And the vast majority of people who have foolish ideas when they're in high school, and I can say that refers to me too. I wasn't always the smartest guy in high school. By the time you get into college, you've realized that you were a dummy and you've corrected your thinking. But the one thing you should never, ever, ever do is let it slide. Never let it slide. Never just shrug your shoulders and walk on. because talking about Jewish people or black people or gay people or women or whatever in a derogatory and a hateful way is very, very often followed by much, much worse things. And you've got to nip it in the bud right away.
Stephen, I want to thank you for your generous time today, and I probably will get requests for more. I want to thank Dimitra Drutzis, the principal of Westmount High, who's really taken a lot of leadership on this issue and approached me to do something special for her school. Eliane Goldstein, who's a grade 9 student who is really leading our student leadership on this issue and one of the co-hosts of our podcast with Mark Bergman, which we'll be doing a podcast on this, and we'll be seeking out some students. Thank you, Westmount High. And Stephen, thank you.
I want to add something. I want to say Mike Cohen has been considerably too modest, and you guys need to grab a hold of Mike and have him switch the screens. He needs to be on my screen, and he needs to talk to you about some of the things that he accomplished in CJC, because I got to tell you, Mike, there's almost nobody else I'd do this for that came out of the community at that time.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm still very close with Jack Silverstone, who ran Canadian Jewish Congress. He is an EMSB alumni, and he will be engaging in some talks with some students, including at St. Clair Laird, where he went to elementary school. Excellent. So thank you again, Stephen. We'll be in touch. Thank you, everyone. And everyone have a great day.